Hello there, and welcome to my continuing series on world government UFO disclosure projects. Today's installment is going to highlight and take a deep dive into the government efforts of New Zealand. New Zealand does have a very rich UFO, UAP encounter experience history. The government very involved in it. I will highlight some of the history that they have had in sightings and disclosures, things like that. Then I'll mention the extent and complexity of the government collection efforts and involvement in reporting and keeping records for this phenomenon. Yes, New Zealand is one of those countries that has a very complex government hands across many different agencies in studying this phenomenon, like other countries, and it's variable. And for those of you in the United States, you're an example of a very spread out, complex effort in terms of obtaining information and cataloging it and whatnot. So after that, I will mention the disclosure efforts and main contributors to that effort, and then give some takeaway conclusions to the New Zealand portion chapter of the phenomenon. So let's dive into a history. The recorded history for New Zealand does go back before the 1900s, but the first big documented public wave happened in 1909, and it's commonly known in New Zealand as the Kelso airships UFO wave. Now, a wave is the phenomenon that the number of incidences, there's many incidences over a long period of time, and this period could be lasting a couple of years, and that was the case with the Kelso airships, in that it was a couple 3-year effort of sightings and recordings and reports by the public to various parts of the New Zealand government. So some of you may be familiar with some of the worldwide phenomenon, encounters, experiences with school children and at various schools. Now in Africa in 1993, I believe, it was the in Rua, Zimbabwe, the Aerial School, and in Australia, Westall, and there's a couple of other incidences in the 1960s. Well, New Zealand also experienced many incidences in schools where many school children and teachers, administrators, and whatnot were involved in these experiences. Amongst them, in 1954, the Moreland School. In 1956, September the 20th, the Southwell School in Cloudlands, where I believe it was over 100 children, teachers, and administrators experienced ships flying through the sky, and one actually did land for a brief period of time. 1957, the Taradale School in Hawke's Bay, where 10 or more children and the same quantity number of teachers experienced. And then again in December of 1968, there was another sighting at the same Taradale School. 1975, in May, the Bellevue School in Tauranga, where over 100 children and teachers saw a craft fly in under intelligent control, land, and the potential was there. Reports were that there was an occupant of the craft that was observed and reported by some of the children and some of the teachers. So this phenomenon continued on into the 2000s. In March of 2001, the Katikati College in Tauranga, again, where hundreds of college students, teachers, administrators, and staff had their own visions. There was another wave in the late 1970s, the Waimata Valley Wave, which lasted for about 4 years from 1977 to 1980, all throughout both islands in New Zealand, many encounters. Perhaps the most world-famous event came on December 31st, 1978, the Kakura Lights. This was recorded, and actually the videos still reside on YouTube. Television crews got extended long videos of unidentified phenomenon. They were flying a television news airplane doing a story when this encounter actually happened. Again, it was on New Year's Eve, and they followed, I believe the YouTube video is something like 40 minutes long, but in any event, it lasted so long, and the TV crew was so traumatized by it, they just forgot about the main reason, their news story, that the purpose that they were up there. And the UAP reporting basically took on a worldwide life of its own. So that's just a real brief touch on some of the rich history that New Zealand has experienced in this phenomenon. And there are also, coupled with this, many what are called USO experiences, underwater aerial phenomenon, or USOs, underwater unidentified submerged objects is actually what the term represents. So there's a very rich history from that particular also. So again, New Zealand is representative of the worldwide experience in extensive UAP USO phenomenon. So fast forward, let me just mention here too, now as we come towards the disclosure dates that I'm going to mention here, I want to touch on, as an example, New Zealand, as I mentioned at the outset, has a very complex entanglement of government agencies that have been involved and subsequently have handled and contained reports that they have released in part of their disclosure efforts in 2010. So the hierarchy in New Zealand, the Ministry of Defense, or MOD, which is similar to what exists in Great Britain, they're kind of at the apex of the hierarchy and efforts and authority for curating information and the ultimate decisions on disclosure. Now, underneath them, the New Zealand Defence Forces, and this is where the hierarchy gets really complex. Let me just mention some of the agencies that were involved in the December 2010 disclosure of the New Zealand government documents that were part of that effort. So in New Zealand, the following departments contain various documents and files: the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Secretary of Defense, the Minister of Transport, the Chief of Defense Staff, the Chief of Air Staff, the Headquarters of Air Defense, the Department Director, Deputy Director of Air Intelligence, the Director of Operations. Now, all of these that I've just mentioned, the last four of them, are part of the Royal New Zealand Air Force Agency. So the Deputy Director of Service Intelligence of the RNZ Air Force is also inextricably involved in the curation and documentation efforts and disclosure and whatnot. But also, too, the Magnetic and Geophysical Observatory is reported to have some documents, and the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. So those are just some of the government agencies involved, but let me give you, it continues in terms of the number of agencies and organizations that are involved. Amongst them, departments that do contain UFO data: Civil Aviation Department, Air Traffic Control, the Ministry of Transport, like I mentioned, the Director General, the Department of Science and Industrial Research, Joint Intelligence Commissioner of Police, Police National Headquarters, the New Zealand Meteorological Service, the Director of Carter Observatory. All of these organizations have files which were part of the December 2010 disclosure. Now, as I mentioned this briefly about the nature of the disclosure, there were many pages disclosed. Unfortunately, New Zealand is an example where many more pages are still restricted, and even after and outside of the scope of the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA Act that is present in the United States and many other countries. So there were efforts, FOIA efforts, until new legislation there forced a closure on more release of documents. Efforts were made under the FOIA Acts in New Zealand to disclose some documents, at least anyways. Now, the official government repository for these disclosed documents, there's a government agency, actually two agencies, the Archives of the Government of New Zealand and the New Zealand Defence Force, which was responsible for disclosing in their own efforts in December, the 22nd of December 2010, over 2,100 pages of documentation and reports of incidences lasting in a period from 1952 until 2009. Now, it took efforts for a couple of years running to move the New Zealand government towards the announcement and the ultimate disclosure of these items. So I'm going to mention now the nature of these efforts, and it was undertaken and propelled in a very significant way by Suzanne Hansen, who became the first director, actually she's the current director, of UFO New Zealand Research Network. Now, I'm going to give you their website, and this is going to be one of those websites I'm going to have up on my Humaniverse page. So you're going to want to tap into it and then take a dive into the archives. There's many articles, but just let me mention here, before I give you the website, I'm going to want to enlighten you on the history. So Suzanne Hansen, she's been a ufology researcher for many decades now. In April 29th, in April of 2009, Suzanne Hansen, she had done contacts of various government agencies in the hopes of releasing files. So in April of 2009, she received a written response from the New Zealand government, kind of indicating that they were working on it at the time. Other relevant files are held by this headquarters, but they contain classified and staff-in-confidence information. In terms of subsection 18F of the Official Information Act, it would require a substantial amount of collation, research, and consultation to identify whether any of that information could be released for you. This is an answer to Suzanne Hansen's efforts, initial efforts at least anyways. But let's fast forward into October of 2009. After this response that came to her, they were starting, although their representative stated that it was going to be a very detailed and long-running effort due to the nature of the complexity. As I just exampled to you, all of the various government and official scientific agencies that were involved in keeping files and whatnot. So the coordination effort goes across many different agencies, and you can see the hierarchical difficulties in that to begin with. So, but let's go forward. October 2009, a letter of response to UFO New Zealand, dated, December 2nd, 2009. I am pleased, Suzanne Hansen got this response. I'm pleased to be able to inform you that 2 NZDF officers have begun the task of assessing classified files held in relation to this topic with a view to declassification. I would expect that files which are transferred would be subject to extensive embargo periods in terms of access by the general public. This was later followed up by the Chief of Defense, who made an announcement, a public announcement in September of 2010, that they have done their organization and study, and that they were going to release the files, in which turned out to be on the date of December 22nd, 2010, where they actually released the files. So Suzanne Hansen was the kingpin for efforts to get the New Zealand government to disclose what they have. The website that you can go to, that I'll have on the Humaniverse website, but if you want to take this down, UFO New Zealand, it's U, then the word focus, then NZ, UFO-NZ for New Zealand, .org.nz/articles. Again, ufocusnz.org.nz/articles. And this contains the list of all of the disclosed articles from the various New Zealand government entities, and stand as they are as of December 2010. Now, as I fast forward, it's been 12 years since then. Well, unfortunately, as I mentioned at the outset, New Zealand is representative of one of those governments who is maintaining control over a lot more files. They had passed subsequent legislation in the few years, basically akin to what the U.S. has done in terms of the Freedom of Information Act, and closing up all of the portals there with which public can ask and request that certain documents be disclosed, released to the public. So it's going to take a little while longer, and I think as time goes on, New Zealand will continue to disclose more and more documents, and they're going to add to their archive as more and more events and encounters, reports actually take place. Now, UFO-NZ is also the reporting center. It's for those of you in the U.S. And Canada and some parts of Europe, Australia too. We have, in the U.S., we have 2 public reporting organizations, the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON for short, and the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC is that acronym. These are portals where the public, that if there's a witness that has a sighting, they can report to either of these 2 agencies, and there's varying levels of study and casework that field representatives from these 2 organizations, at least the MUFON organization, will send investigators out to get details and do a study on the witness encounter. So the UFO-NZ is kind of like a repository and open to the public. If there are new reports, they can report to this agency and get their maybe not get their case studied, but they can at least get the reports. And then as time goes on, officials from UFOCUS have mentioned that they want to step into the effort of being able to collate and organize data for further analysis, investigation, and whatnot. So one last thing I want to mention before the takeaways here is that New Zealand, and this is part of the reason why the disclosure efforts have stopped, New Zealand was a longtime partner in a treaty with the U.S. and Australia. It's called the Anzus Treaty. And Anzus Treaty was known as the Security Treaty between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States of America, signed in September of 1951. This treaty is key in understanding and being able to appreciate that why governments, at least these governments, will refuse to disclose the reports of existence of ET and UFOs and whatnot. There's a region in Australia called Pine Gap that is very secretive. It's Australia's version of the United States Area 51 in that, or Bletchley Park in Britain. It's very, very, how will I put this, highly suspect activities appear to be going on, many unusual sightings to provide evidence for it, but much work involved within the confines of the Pine Gap facilities and region have led long time for Australians and New Zealanders and the U.S. as part of military treaty. Again, this is military presence in Pine Gap, Australia. But because of the activities that are not disclosed there and that seem to be going on, which are manifested in the reports of witnessing and sightings and visualizations and incidents that seem to be occurring over there. That seems to be why there's still more reluctance amongst those three members of the treaty to refuse to disclose information in those particular areas. So as you tune into my video on Australia's government efforts, I will be mentioning more about Pine Gap and the Anzus Treaty. But for now, New Zealand is a member of it. They became estranged quite a few years ago, back in 1984, and it had to do with nuclear proliferation information and things like that, with disagreements with the U.S. Navy. But that kind of led to the New Zealand disclosure in 2010 of the files that they have disclosed. But as I mentioned, as I segue into the takeaway portion here, the New Zealand bureaucracy, even with the presence of the Anzus Treaty and freedom of information activities and the complexities of their intertwined government agency archives, that their bureaucracy is as complex in many, many ways as the U.S. and many other world governments. There is, thankfully, present in New Zealand, heavy public activity witness, and I encourage you to go to the UFocus NZ website, and you'll be able to obtain lots of information, and it'll prove to you that the public there is very, very, very involved. This just goes as the main takeaway before I sign off here. The New Zealanders are experiencing the same ways and the same volume as the rest of humankind around the world. Many New Zealanders from all walks of life, all professions throughout hundreds of years now, have documented reports of unusual encounters, incidents, witness reports, and whatnot. And that just leads me back to the main takeaway that I have, is that this phenomenon, ET and UFO and UAP, intelligent beings, this study will involve more than science. It's as you can see, the military and government is inextricably involved, but this is a humankind, this is a species-related problem, and for us to be able to provide the ultimate enlightenment, which is the disclosure that we are not alone, come to accept and move our civilization past that point, that we have to recognize that the effort is going to need to come from those individuals from all walks of life and all professions, more than just the science, military, and government. So let me sign off here. Thank you for tuning in. I'm sorry I ran a little bit long here, but there's lots of information to go on as my survey of world government UFO disclosure continues. You're going to find it's a very active environment and community indeed. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Bye now.